And you always have to ask somebody and have to give somebody your money. And that's, in my perspective, that's not a good start for a creative process.
Hello everybody, welcome back to the Current Art Podcast. I'm Yaching, and it's so nice to have you back. And recently, I've learned a new word called Gichikando. Gichikando means informal dwellings that constructed by migrants on the outskirts of large cities. So it's originally a Turkish word, but I've seen it several times in connection with describing the squatting scenes in Berlin. There's an initiative called Coty & Co. They built up this like wooden structures in the middle of Kapstator area in Kreuzberg district in Berlin. So they set up like wooden tables and benches. This place quickly became a neighborhood social center. They organized the protests against the rising of the rents. And they were quite successful because they forced the Berlin Senate to cap rents in over 35,000 social housing units across the city. And you can still find this Coty & Co. today in Kapstator. And Kapstator, there are so many Turkish immigrants living in that area. It's a very interesting, like visually interesting area. So let me paint you a little picture. It is a dense populated area compared with a lot of other places in Berlin. And the houses are really tall, 10 to 11 floor. It has a very futuristic and surrealistic look because of the building are all in a very weird shape. So if you ever watch those cyberpunk film, you can find a relationship of the visuals. So if you can imagine those housings, those giant housings, they form a circle in that area. And they are all interconnected with stairs. And most interesting visual is the Hochbahn, like above the ground subway. This glass structured Hochbahn is cutting through this very dense populated houses, apartment houses. And if you look below, there's just so many things going on. Like there always traffic, of course, but there are also numerous bars, restaurants, even a little casino. And you also see like Turkish fruit seller. And there's also lots of restaurants, and the traffic, the road is a little bit confusing, is a little bit, in German word, maybe called durcheinander, like really cutting through each other and goes everywhere. So this Gichikando is a place for meeting. If I think about, okay, where to meet a person in New York City or in Berlin, of course, my first thought will come to, oh, of course, we will meet in a cafe. This is the most proper space for people to meet each other. So I buy myself a little coffee, and so I have the table to sit for a while, because it's very difficult in New York to find a place that you can meet somebody, maybe park, but just in the city. And the city is constructed by, if you want to have your own space, if you want to meet somebody, you must consume. And this would really connect with my memory when I was back in China in 2023. Like after 5 years living abroad, I came back to Beijing for a short visit. And the city itself changed a lot. Especially my friend told me, do you know where do we hang out nowadays? Like, do we know where local people hang out? I said, no. And they told me the shopping malls. So those gigantic shopping malls that encompass everything. You can eat there, you can play games there, shopping and drinking coffee, buy groceries. So it's those giant shopping mall that serves all the needs and is super comfortable in summer. It is a very artificial structure, and I assume only if you earn enough money, then you can afford this kind of places. If every time you want to meet up somebody outside of your home. I mentioned all those things is because it's almost become part of my subconscious that I think if I want to meet somebody in the public space, I must pay for that space. There's nowhere that belongs to me. This is this initiative and many people who participate the squatting scene in Berlin trying to ask or trying to question us. Like, what is home and what is public spaces? Is home a place that you pay, like your property that you own, private? Or it can also be a place for collective living experience and potentially cooperation. And maybe also a place that you can learn some skills, repairing skills. And maybe a meeting place can be free. You don't need to pay for a retreat to spend time with people, or you don't need to pay for a table. That it can also be free. It can also happen in so many places in the city. I found this very charming quality of Berlin, that there's still a lot of Gichikando structures in Berlin. Of course, it's slowly dying out as investors coming in took over the squatted apartment. And this summer, while I was in Berlin, I got to know a filmmaker. His name is Johannes Blume. I've been very lucky to see. So this summer, when I was back to Berlin, I was being invited to a film screening happened in Tipi House. So this Tipi House is located in the middle of the city. And it's also a form of Gichikando. So it's a self-organized, self-built, like temporary living space. And they also have a event menu. They provide almost free cultural experiences like film screening. So in one of those film screenings I was being invited, I've seen a film from Berlin filmmaker Johannes Blume. And in his film, Berlin Utopiekadaver. It's documented a emotional journey about those squatting collectives, some very young people. They found those empty apartments in Berlin and built everything there, but slowly they're facing the evictions and facing gentrifications. But they provide a very different understanding about how can we live in the urban city. So today, I'm very lucky to have a remote conversation with the filmmaker Johannes Blume and talk about that his idea and his experiences of gentrification and like how does he sees like the squatting scenes and subculture in Berlin. So stay tuned.
I think for me, like as a Berliner growing up here and seeing all the changes of the city, for me it was the idea. Also at the beginning was like to have this kind of magnifying glass to shoot a film about this left autonomous scene and the squatting scene, but the idea was to portray the scene, but also like a magnifying glass to portray the changing of the city, the whole change of the city. Because I think there are so many connections between the subculture of the squatting scene here in Berlin and the gentrification in Berlin. So that was always the idea. I mean, it sounds so negative or manipulative, but I don't mean that like this. But I wanted to use this kind of portray of the subculture to portray and show the impact of the gentrification in Berlin.
How is your experience when growing up in East Berlin? Like, how's the subculture look like in 90s?
Yeah. I mean, I didn't grow up in the GDR because I'm too young, but of course I know the East Berlin areas before the gentrification. So the great houses and the vivid and colorful subculture from below in a way in the city. And yeah, that was always interesting because you see I saw so much happening in this kind of ugly gray surrounding. Like for example, you had this in Berlin in the streets. These I don't know the English word for it, but these places for plants at the sidewalk. And nobody cared about the plants. So the whole plants just grew over the sidewalk and grow over the street. And it was really interesting because it looked so wild. And now everything is really clean. Like you have like a couple of trees, but the trees are very like clean and tidied up in a way. So the whole wild places are gone in the streets.
Oh, I totally agree with you. It feels like everything that now is more regulated and more controlled.
Yeah. And especially in Berlin, that's a huge loss because Berlin is a city living from this kind of wild places the people are using and becoming creative to create something. And Berlin, for me, of course, this is just my perspective, but for me, Berlin is not a place which could work in this kind of clean, rich, posh, after the gentrification in a way, because Berlin is not that kind of interesting city after all the creatives are leaving the city or left the city. And I had to think about, like, because I know that we are talking today and you are in New York. And I know that a lot of people in the 90s and early 2000s told me that Berlin has this kind of spirit from New York before the gentrification, like before all this quarter scene left New York and all this, because I think New York is even worse than Berlin in this kind of gentrification topic. And I think now too many places are lost, and now we have the same. Maybe, I don't know. I mean, I was in New York, but 20 years ago, I think, or 15 years ago. But I think now we have the same issue as New York, that it's just too clean and too uncreative in a way.
Interesting for artists, or it's becoming a place that is very hard for artists to create because everything is so tidied up. Why do you think that is the reason? Like, why do you think this kind of tidiness would actually in some way limit people's imagination? Like, people cannot really fully let go and then get into this creative flow.
I think the reasons are very pragmatic. Is it the word? Yeah. Because, for example, myself, like, if you look for a space for an artist to work in, it starts with 450 euros for just a table in a big office place. And for me, it's not a place to be creative in. So I think before all this gentrification stuff happened, you could just use places and meet people and meet other creatives and start working. But now you really have to look for places to work in. And if you don't have money, you can't use any spaces because there are any without spending so much money. And I think it's always money is limiting art. I mean, if you have to earn money with your art, it's always, for me, is my perspective, it's limiting your creative process. And especially if you want to meet with other people. I mean, now you have to go to a library or maybe a cafe, but also in a cafe or bar, you have to spend money to drink something. And for me, you don't feel this kind of freedom. I mean, before you could just meet at places and own the places and build something for your own. But now every places are owned by somebody, and you always have to ask somebody and have to give somebody your money. And that's, in my perspective, that's not a good start for a creative process.
I think when I watch your film, I was really interested into those teenagers when they were living in post drugstore, and then they were talking about this collective living really gives them the chance to experience life, and to experience life that's something that in their original family they could not do it.
Yeah.
I think I was really touched by that because I think squatting apartment and then build your life around that, maybe all those little process of learning how to repair things and how to build your own furnitures in some ways that really create bonds in between people. And then they feel like this squatted apartment is more like their home rather than their original family.
Yeah.
And I wonder, how did you get to know those people? How did you discover them?
Yeah. I mean, it was always, that's also interesting about this subculture, because it was always connected to the places. So for me, I think maybe one or two, but I mean, there are lots of people in the film. and it was always connected to the places. So I was interested in the place, and then I got to know the people living or working in the place. And Potze Drugstore, of course, it's for the youth. So when I heard that Potze is jeopardized, and so they have this eviction problem. For me, of course, it was clear that I will meet younger people. And for me, it was always also very interesting because, of course, there's a difference between people who are 40, 50, 30 years old and working or living in this subculture than people who are in their 20s or teenagers. And it was very interesting to hear that the people are feeling, in a way, the same as the older people. And also what you said is that it's so interesting to hear that that these places are so important. Because, for example, I have a friend, and she's a trans person, and we talked about living as a trans person, the normal life in a way. So if you see movies or television shows, also in America, when you see trans persons, transgenders, maybe not always, but a lot of it's often portrayed like this very glamorous and very look at me, I'm so beautiful and elegant and like I am a star. And of course it's nice to see people who have this self-confidence, but at the same time the normal life for a normal trans person looks different, like differently. When they, go shopping and walking on the streets and go dating or whatever, the assaults and the problems they have dressing normally as a person who identifies with a different gender, you know what I mean. And seeing those younger people, also like trans people, seeing those places like safer places, is so interesting, because for me as a cis man, heterosexual, I never had this kind of connections, or maybe I had connections but not so deeply. And there was this film screening in Rigastraße 94, and this is kind of a place always connecting to violence, and there was a film screening in also a youth club, Keimzelle, and Keimzelle and Potze Drugstore. These are the three left important youth clubs in Berlin. And it was so interesting to talk to them, because they are 15, 16, 17 years old. And they also told me that this place, Keimzelle, is such an important place for them, because some people of them are, their parents are not from Germany and they are trans or gay. And these places are, they feel normal in a way in these places and safe.
Is it also because of that they are really living on the edge of the society, and then they find they could take care of each other? Like, how is their relationship look like living in this collective space? I'm very interested into those intimate moments, that how do we understand other people's life? Yeah, because that's what I'm always interested in different perspectives, and that's why I'm saying that for me as a cis man, heterosexual, of course I can't feel what they feel, but giving them a stage to talk about their struggle, and not even the struggle, but also the positive sides, living or working in these kind of places. I think it's very, very important, because of course they didn't choose they didn't choose to be the way they are, and
So they have to feel secure, because everything else would be unfair.
Can you name a person, or is it okay to name a person that from your film that you felt like that you learned so much from this person's life experience that which is so different from you?
I don't know. I don't feel so. Maybe that's just me, but I don't feel so many. I don't feel so much difference, because when you connect to people with a person on a deeper level, for me it's always astonishing that I feel the same, but in my world, like. If you break up with your love, for example, and it's astonishing to for me. It's just, of course, just my perspective, but to talk to a person from a maybe it's wrong to say that, but from a very different world, if you know what I mean. And at the same time, you feel so many connections that there's not such. As much as difference as you maybe think before you are meeting those people.
And then I was also very interested into the teenagers that you were talking about.
Mm-hmm.
How did they start to self-organize, like squatting apartment? And is it still going on?
Yeah, that's the thing, because so the idea of the film was really like give the people, like the subculture, in the stage. I mean, of course, it's my film, and what I said before, that the idea was to use them in a kind of magnifying glass to portray the whole change of the city. But the idea was also like that they have the stage and they talk about their emotions and the feelings. And so although the film is a lot with talking, the idea was to make an emotional film. So, for example, like at the beginning, talking to the people, I always had to distinguish myself between, like, I was always saying that I'm a film director and this will be a film for the cinema, and I'm not a journalist, and this will be not a television piece for like showing this next week and then it's forgotten. So because that was my idea and my concept, I didn't ask so many questions and I didn't do so much research on facts, like on historic facts, or how do you get there, and so I wasn't so interested about, you know what I mean, about the connections of the history. I was more interested about feelings and talking to them as people. So if you ask me about the future and the history, I can't really answer that, because I was for example, like there you see an eviction in the film, like from Köpiwagenplatz, and the film showed, for me, that was my idea, to talk to the people about their feelings and how it felt, this kind of feeling of the danger of the eviction and what they lost. But I wasn't talking about how it how did it come to this point. Like, I didn't talk about with politicians, or I didn't do any research about the history of that place, because I was more interested in feelings and the people. So if you ask me how, don't know, Zozo from Drugstore came to what's her story, I can't really tell. I just can't tell or talk about how they are feeling, or how they have felt about the place for their heart, in a way. You know what I mean? Like, yeah.
Of course. It's interesting. I never know anybody in China that ever squatted apartment.
Yeah.
I do know how does it work, I came here, I have no idea how does it work. For my mind, it's something that is unimaginable because this concept doesn't exist. So I was born in this world in 1996, and then I think everything, every apartment, every building is owned by somebody. Like it's either owned by the state or either owned by a private company. And then the way to gain those little spaces and then to use these resources is that you work hard.
Yeah.
So you work hard, earn a lot of money, so eventually you are able to afford one of those places. That's how I understand like living and dealing with the world. And it's for me really refreshing to know, or on the other side of the world, there's a group of young people. And then they are so young, they're 16 or 15, and they got together and then they lived in this apartment. And for me, it's really hard to imagine because for a squatted apartment, you don't know when the eviction comes. So, but you still have to put all of those energies into fixing everything. So I just wondering, like, what drives them, like, to do all those difficult works? Because I'm sure they are very young, and then they also have to learn it themselves. So I wonder what kind of like emotional journey they went through, and then like when they know that this might not be a permanent places they're going to live forever, like.
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak for them, of course, but I think it's also like this kind of relationship between Berlin as a city and everybody here, and this subculture, because this idea of squatting a place and using empty places is was kind of common in Berlin. Like, for example, like my parents had nothing to do with the squatting scene, and also like friends of mine, their parents, they just used empty flats left alone in East Berlin because nobody cared in a way. Nobody cared about these empty spaces, and this is a kind of freedom you just use because you don't have to spend any money, and you feel this freedom that you do something and not somebody else, adults or teachers or parents or whatever. They don't tell you what to do, but you can't create something on your own. I mean, it's kind of the idea of art in a way. And so this is such beauty in it, to use the city as your place to express yourself. And there was opportunities to do that, but now it's gone because you see so many. I don't know the English word for when you have just empty space, so just dirt, like just earth, no house or anything. Because you had so many places like this in Berlin, and people just used them for doing something like theater or movies or living there, and they just create something without apply for funding or anything. And of course there's so much freedom in it, and especially for young people it's so important to use or to have this kind of freedom. I mean, as a young person, to always have this kind of limitations to express yourself, it's like, it's not good everywhere, I think. And you see this, for example, when I had my first flat in Berlin, I had this idea of my flat is my space. Like I can, like paint the walls and build a kitchen or whatever. And my second or third flat was owned by this international corporation, and I didn't have this feeling of this is my place. I just had this feeling of I am a normal tenant and they just want to use me like I'm just an obstacle to earn more money. That it would be much better if I would leave this place so they have this empty place to earn more money. I mean, this is toxic. I mean, if you ask about young people, I mean, that's the idea of being young, to feel free. And if you don't have like this free, safe spaces for younger people, it's toxic. And I think for me, as a Berliner, seeing this kind of over 30 years, that for me, gentrification and money is kind of a fault and the big issue of that people don't feel free anymore. Because of course they can meet in a park or in a library or anything, but of course it's much more freedom. Like they feel much more freely if they own a place which they can create in their own mind.
What you're talking about is super interesting, that those young people, they have the space for themselves to create. That's really interesting thing that I never learned when I grew up in China, because for me, creativity is like you go to a art studio and then to draw Greek sculptures. Yeah. And then we never learned how to create things from like destruction. So from something that is wild and it doesn't have any orders. Yeah. So for me, I was growing up in an environment where there's a lot of orders and there's a lot of limitations that tell you what to do and how to do things.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting, because I think, I mean, I told you this before, like, of course, this is just my opinion, my perspective, but for me, Berlin is really a city living from this kind of destruction that after the World War or during the World War, Berlin was destroyed so much. And, the separation in the East. And so for me, Berlin is really like a city living from the energy and from the spirits from the people or of the people, and not from outside, not from big companies or people with money. Because, I mean, there is this kind of, for me, I don't know if it's correct, but if you ask people, like maybe even in New York, what they think about Berlin, what comes to mind? It's like the graffiti scene. It's like the squatting scene. It's like the techno underground clubs, and it's like the culture from created by people, and not like big money places or beautiful streets or beautiful parks. I mean, of course, we have parks here and they are beautiful, but for me, Berlin is a place where creativity could develop, like what I imagine New York was in the 80s or 90s, like this whole hip-hop scene and everything. And now almost everything is gone because it's just it's becoming too expensive. I mean, of course, there are places, but the process, what you see, the development over the last 30 years after the wall came down is really like from this kind of perspective, very negative. I mean, of course, you can see positive sides, that houses are looking more clean and the streets are more clean and stuff. But I mean, maybe that's also an interesting or maybe even unique thing about Berlin, that for me, always just my perspective, but for me, Berlin used to be a very poor city and like this destruction, what you said, but you can't equal that in Berlin with problems like drugs or real poverty. Like for me, you can, in Berlin, it's like you see more creativity. Because what I told you before, that my parents or my friends' parents are also squatted like empty apartments because they were creative in a way. And yeah, so the city was poor, but the people didn't feel poor. Because, for example, one saying of a friend of mine, she's a woman older than me, and it really stuck into my head what she told me, like when we talked about the GDR, when she was walking through East Berlin, she never saw the gray houses because she told me like she saw the colorful life behind the gray curtains, like the gray houses. And I think this is really beautiful, and this this describes Berlin very well in my perspective. Yeah, the shops, like you had so many little shops and flea markets and stuff. And now you see so many empty spaces, but not empty because they are not used in a way, but they are empty because the rent is too high that people can't afford the places to rent for their little shops or for their creativity or for their cafes. Now you see in Berlin a lot of empty places, or when the places are not empty, you see big chains in those places, like big bakery chains or some stores like like something like Kentucky Fried Chicken or whatever, like big companies and not these little shops. And for me, I don't know if it's still correct, but for me, this is the reason why people from other countries and also tourists coming to Berlin to experience this kind of subculture.
It's the people who add another color to the city. Like the city itself, as you said, is ugly, quote unquote saying ugly, because of, I think maybe what you mean ugly is without so much decorations. Like the decorations are people's activity. They're making small things or they drawing on the wall, like making graffitis. Is that what you're talking about when you talk about like what behind the gray houses?
Yeah, and yes, and also like if, for example, if you see Paris, for example, Paris is a beautiful city and it's very, what is the English word? Homogeneous, homogene, like it's very like one piece. Like you walk through the cities and it's very beautiful in a way. And here in Berlin, I mean, if I would show you my point of view out of my window, you see just new buildings. And almost every building is by a new architecture or by a new architect. So that's what I meant also with it's an ugly city, that Berlin was bombed and destroyed so much. And the rebuilding was not from one mind. I mean, of course, I don't know if I'm correct, but I have the feeling that Berlin, if you're walking through cities, through streets, you see so many different styles of buildings and often not so beautiful ones. Like it seems to me, of course it's not correct, but it seems to me like every architect student in Berlin or Germany could create something. And the result is that you're walking through a city and you see so many new buildings, but they don't really care about the idea or the whole picture of the city.
What you're talking about is very interesting, that you're talking about like a kind of a culture that is self-built, that without so much surveillance or without so much like centered voice, not unifying makes it like really juicy at some point, like because it's all different in one city. That is very, very rare.
Yeah.
And I really like during your film that you started with a taxi driver's perspective. from his like description that he works in Berlin for like decades, and that he actually witnessed like changes on the street. That's very interesting too for me.
Yeah. But I just want to add that I'm not for a unified or kind of boring city. I don't want that. Of course, I don't want that the city or all the buildings are looking the same. I'm just talking about that. I mean, it's interesting to talk about it because what you see here is it seems to me that in this kind of socialized capitalistic way, that people with money don't just think about their own vision and create their own posh and rich vision without thinking about the city as one. Because of course I don't want a city which looks everywhere you look the same. But it's interesting. I never thought about it, but it's interesting that you because I am talking about the subculture and this poor creative Berlin, because of course everything was different. You know what I mean? It's interesting because because I'm criticizing in a way that the city isn't unified anymore in their look. But at the same time, of course, every collective or artist, of course, the idea is to express themselves as individuals and not to think about the city as one. But yeah, you know what I mean? It's interesting. Maybe it's just the difference between having money and pretending to create something posh and not fitting to the city.
Yeah, I understand what you're talking about, because sometimes I'm thinking about like as an artist that you learn how to create. Like it seems like you want to create, and then you go to the art school, and then you learn a bunch of things. You learn the references, you learn the art history, and then you learn different history. So you wish that in some way those things could help you to become more creative, to create more meaningful work for the society. But at some point, when you are in this very regulated place, when you are learning everything, you also lose the chance to really experience the living by itself. And also, I feel like this is a process also losing the intuition to create. So when I saw the people, like the punk rock people in your film, I have such a strong, not envy, but it's like I feel like they can create from how they feel like about this hatred against police in Berlin. Like everybody hates police in Berlin, and then they could really use that anger in order to create. I feel like I'm living in such regulated places in the world, and that anger is kind of, it's gone. It's gone, and it's very hard to get it back.
You talked about the anger and the taxi driver, right? That was I mean, it's a kind of definition of art, maybe. I mean, for me, these young or older people, like people from the subculture, for me, it's kind of course, like an expression. And so it's also art to work with their anger and make something out of their feeling of losing something. I mean, you hear in the film punk rock songs about the police, and you see how they are shouting, everyone in Berlin is hating the police. And of course, this is also creative. So they didn't, I mean, they didn't fight the police. They just, shouted or made music or go on demonstrations, and it's always a creative process. And of course, it's very important that you are allowed to express this kind of anger and to have this freedom of speech. And this is also like what you said, that you grow up in this kind of regulated space. And if you can't meet in this kind of safer spaces and free places anymore, how will they express their anger in the future? I mean, it just can't be I can imagine it will be worse, of course, than creating punk rock songs or going on demonstrations. I mean, because it's building up, of course. If people can't express their anger, it's building up inside, and maybe then something worse will happen. Nobody wants, of course,
And I think it's also beautiful when the teenagers or the young people, they talk so much about their negative emotions. They talk about emotion in a way that is really free, is without any self-regulation. I find that's something that is very different from education system, maybe. As my understanding of being an adult or living in a society, it's like you learn how to regulate your emotions. So you have therapists, you have medications, you have meditations, you have yoga studio. Those are the things that were there to remind you a useful member in the society is somebody that who knows how to perform in a manner that is portraying this kind of calmness. When the youth in your film, they go out of control when facing the police, or they talk about their family traumas in a way that they don't have any shame. They're not holding it back. They're very confident about their experience. This is just how I experience. I'm not going to put a makeup over my experience. That's very vulnerable, but in some way very authentic. And that's how I feel your film. That is a very authentic piece that it's really connect. I wonder, when the city has changed so much, I wonder how those people still connect with this kind of authentic emotions that they have, or this anger that was kind of a drive for changes. Now Berlin has changed so much, and then we also see like this kind of a gentrified scene on the street, in the corner of the street, and there are so many interesting shops anymore, as you said, and also we are losing a lot of spaces for artists and for people who just want to create, or people who doesn't have enough money to afford like a large renovated apartment. Of course, I think this kind of emotions or anger has also been repressed in some way. So how do we start to reconnect with this kind of anger again, like so we can ask for changes in our daily life, in our creative life?
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm thinking also like if, like what you told, that you have the feeling that the people are talking very freely about their emotions. And maybe this will be a negative outcome also about the gentrification, that people are holding more back and start to medicate and their anger and their emotions. And maybe these free places or safer places are also better for dealing and talking about their emotions. And maybe, I don't know, but maybe the rich, unified, gentrified city is maybe a reason why people are more suppressing their feelings and feel more caged in a way. I mean, would make sense, yeah. And for me, in this kind of surroundings, because of course I'm living also, I mean, I'm living in the center of Berlin. I mean, my neighborhood is really like not something I identify with. So for me, art is a way to express and to deal with this kind of anger and emotions we are all dealing with. And for me, it's really nice to see that cinema is becoming or is coming back. I have the feeling, I don't know how it is in New York, but I have the feeling that in Berlin, cinema is coming back. And of course, demonstrations and collective working and connecting to people is also a kind of art form to talk and express feelings. And yeah. But yeah, I mean, my film is very negative, so I feel lost as many people. So I don't have any solutions, but I think we just have to keep making art and express ourselves and work to feel this kind of freedom, yeah, and humanity in a way. I mean, if you, don't feel appreciated or don't feel free in your neighborhood, in your home, it's difficult to express yourself.
Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. Because me as a immigrant, I'm not native to any squatting scenes in Berlin. And I'm trying to learn from it. I'm trying to observe, trying to output more things that I know that to my audiences. And thank you so much for your patience, and thank you for listening to what I experienced, but also tolerate my mistake. And I will see you next week. I'm available on YouTube Podcasts, YouTube Music, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Pocket Podcasts. So see you next week. Ciao, ciao.